In the early morning hours before dawn broke over the Normandy coastline, when the world still existed in that peculiar state of half-darkness that precedes sunrise, a German naval officer stood at his post overlooking the English Channel and experienced a moment that would define the remainder of his existence. Walter Olmsen, an Oberleutnant in the German Navy stationed at the Crisbeck battery along the Normandy coast, had been routinely scanning the horizon with his binoculars as he had done countless times before when something unprecedented materialized before his eyes. The date was June 6, 1944, and the time was approximately 5 o'clock in the morning when Olmsen first perceived what his mind initially struggled to accept as reality. Through the optical lenses of his trembling binoculars, the 32-year-old officer witnessed a sight that contradicted every reassurance that had filtered down from the highest echelons of German military command. The English Channel, that body of water which German strategists had relied upon as a natural barrier protecting the western borders of Hitler's continental empire, had undergone a transformation that defied comprehension. What had been empty sea now appeared as an unbroken highway constructed entirely of steel, a maritime armada so vast that individual vessels merged into a single, continuous mass extending from one edge of the visible horizon to the other. The sheer magnitude of what approached the French coastline that morning represented something beyond mere military force. It was approaching doom made manifest in physical form. The invasion fleet that Olmsen observed through his Zeiss rangefinder consisted of 6,939 vessels of various types and purposes. Among this staggering total were 1,213 warships designed for combat operations, 4,126 landing craft specifically constructed to transport troops and equipment from ship to shore, 736 ancillary craft serving support functions, and 864 merchant vessels pressed into military service. Manning these thousands of ships were more than 195,000 naval personnel drawn from 8 different Allied nations, representing a coalition of forces that spanned the democratic world. As Olmsen attempted to process what he was seeing, his training and experience as a military officer began cataloguing the implications of such overwhelming force arrayed against the defences he helped man. At precisely 52 minutes past 5 in the morning, Olmsen's battery received the command to commence firing upon the approaching armada. 3 minutes later, at 5:55, the first shells launched from his Czech-manufactured Škoda cannons, massive 210mm weapons, traced their arc through the pre-dawn sky toward the invasion fleet. The futility of the gesture struck Olmsen even as he executed his orders. These shells were like individual drops of water hurled against an approaching tsunami. His battery directed its fire toward vessels identified as American cruisers, specifically the USS Tuscaloosa and the USS Quincy, as well as the battleship USS Nevada. Later that morning, at 10 minutes before 7, his guns would achieve what would prove to be their most significant success of the day when they struck and sank the destroyer USS Corey, which would be recorded in history as the only American destroyer lost during the D-Day invasion. From the vantage point of his reinforced concrete observation post positioned atop the Crisbeck battery, this German naval officer had achieved the dubious distinction of becoming the first defender of Fortress Europe to sight and engage the Allied invasion force. What Olmsen perceived through his precision German optical equipment that morning transcended the mere presence of an invasion fleet. It represented the physical embodiment of an industrial capacity that Nazi propaganda machinery had repeatedly assured him could not possibly exist. The mathematics of inevitable defeat were sailing toward his position at a steady 8 knots, and somewhere in the recesses of his military mind, Olmsen understood that what he was witnessing marked a transformation of warfare itself. The hours that would follow would prove that initial impression correct, as German officers stationed at various positions across the Normandy coast would each in turn witness demonstrations of Allied industrial might that would systematically shatter every assumption they had held about their enemy's capabilities and resources. This morning of June 6, 1944, marked not just the beginning of the liberation of Europe, but the beginning of the end for Adolf Hitler's proclaimed thousand-year Reich, which would ultimately endure for just 12 years before collapsing under the weight of its own hubris and the combined industrial power of the Allied nations. The darkness that had enveloped Normandy during the night of June 5th had brought with it various ominous portents that something unprecedented was approaching. At the headquarters of Army Group B, located in La Roche-Guyon, some 50 miles distant from the coastal defences, Lieutenant General Hans Speidel maintained his vigilant monitoring of incoming reports that grew increasingly disturbing as the night progressed. Speidel had assumed the position of Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel on April 15th of that year, and he brought to the role a methodical attention to detail that served him well on this particular night. The irony of the situation was not lost on Speidel as he reviewed the reports. Rommel himself was absent from his command post, having travelled to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, convinced that the inclement weather conditions made any invasion attempt highly unlikely, if not impossible. At 20 minutes past 1 in the morning, the 7th Army received notification that massive parachute drops were occurring across multiple locations throughout Normandy. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions of the American Army, collectively numbering more than 13,000 men, were at that very moment being delivered to French soil by fleets of Douglas C-47 Skytrain transport aircraft. General d'Artillery Erich Marx, who commanded the 84th Corps from his headquarters in Saint-Lô, grasped the significance immediately upon receiving the reports. Marx was a veteran of the brutal Eastern Front campaigns who had lost a leg during the catastrophic Battle of Stalingrad, and the experience of combat in that merciless theatre had honed his tactical instincts to a razor's edge. Yet even Marx, recognized as one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced and capable commanders, could not have imagined the true scale of what was approaching the French coastline. The German defenders had indeed prepared for an invasion. They had spent years constructing elaborate coastal fortifications, positioning artillery, laying mines, and drilling their troops for the day when the Allies would attempt to return to the European continent. What they had not prepared for, what they could not have prepared for, was an industrial avalanche that would bury them under sheer material superiority of a magnitude that exceeded their capacity to comprehend or counter. Vice Admiral Friedrich Rüger, who had been appointed as naval advisor to Rommel in November of 1943, had devoted months to inspecting the coastal defences and had pressed continuously for more mines, more obstacles, more guns to be emplaced along the Atlantic Wall. Born into a naval family in 1894, Rouge possessed a deeper understanding of maritime operations than perhaps any other German officer stationed in France. Despite his expertise and his efforts, Rouge would later write in his memoir titled Rommel in Normandy a confession that captured the fundamental mistake in German strategic thinking. We were preparing to fight the last war. They were bringing the next one. The German High Command had convinced itself through a combination of wishful thinking and intelligence failures that the Allies possessed the capacity to mount an invasion with perhaps 20 divisions at most, supported by maybe 3,000 vessels of various types. They had based these calculations on their own capabilities, their own limitations, their own experience of scarcity, and the increasing industrial exhaustion that afflicted Germany after 5 years of total war. The German military machine, which had conquered much of Europe in the early years of the conflict, was by 1944 operating under severe resource constraints that coloured every strategic calculation and every tactical decision. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the Normandy coastline on the morning of June 6th, German observers stationed in bunkers and observation posts stretching from Cherbourg in the west to Le Havre in the east began transmitting reports of something that seemed impossible. They reported not hundreds of ships as anticipated, but thousands of vessels covering the sea. This was not a raid or a feint designed to draw attention from the real invasion elsewhere, but rather the largest amphibious invasion in the entire history of human warfare. At Strong Point WN62, which overlooked the beach sector that would soon become infamous under the name Omaha Beach, a young soldier named Heinrich Severlo peered through the sight of his machine gun at 45 minutes past 5 in the morning. Severlo, a 20-year-old farm boy from the German town of Metzingen, had never laid eyes on the ocean before receiving his assignment to a coastal defence position in Normandy. Now, as he looked out toward where the ocean should have been visible, he saw no ocean at all, only an endless expanse of steel. Ships were everywhere his eyes turned, ships of every description, large ships with flat bottoms designed for beach landings, destroyers racing back and forth like sheepdogs herding a flock, and in the background, larger vessels whose purposes he could only guess at. The horizon itself had disappeared, obscured by the sheer density of the invasion fleet. Severlo attempted to count the vessels, but abandoned the effort when his count exceeded 100, and he realized there were still thousands more beyond his ability to enumerate. Across the entire 50-mile front where the Allied invasion forces would come ashore, German officers and enlisted soldiers experienced the same stunning realization washing over them in waves. They were not facing merely superior numbers, which military training had prepared them to confront, but rather they faced a different order of magnitude entirely, something that transcended conventional military calculations and entered the realm of industrial warfare on a scale previously unimagined. At 5:30 in the morning, the naval bombardment commenced, and with it came the German defenders' first lesson in the mathematics of American industrial power. The Allied fleet had available for shore bombardment 5 battleships, each mounting massive naval rifles capable of hurling shells weighing hundreds of pounds for distances of many miles, 20 cruisers equipped with medium-caliber guns ideal for destroying coastal fortifications, 65 destroyers that could provide close support with their rapid-firing weapons, and 2 monitors, specialized vessels designed specifically for coastal bombardment. The USS Texas, one of the American battleships participating in the bombardment, provided a statistical example that captured the essence of Allied material superiority. This single ship fired 255 rounds from her 14-inch main battery guns during the first hour of the bombardment alone. Each individual shell fired from these massive weapons weighed 1,400 pounds, meaning that in the space of just 60 minutes, one American battleship had delivered 178 tons of high explosives onto German defensive positions, a tonnage that exceeded the total ammunition reserves possessed by many German artillery regiments in their entirety. Before the first Allied soldier set foot upon the beaches of Normandy, before any infantry engagement commenced, the Allied naval forces had already fired approximately 50,000 shells from their destroyers, 23,000 shells from their cruisers, and 3,500 shells from their battleships, delivering roughly 130,000 tons of explosives onto the coastal defences. General der Infanterie Günther Blumentritt, who served as Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief West, would later provide testimony that captured the German perspective on this bombardment with a simple statement: "We had prepared to fight soldiers. We found ourselves fighting factories." At 6 o'clock in the morning, even as naval shells continued to pulverize the Atlantic Wall fortifications, German defenders witnessed the second major demonstration of Allied industrial superiority manifesting in the skies above them. The air filled with aircraft, not the dozens or hundreds that might have been expected based on German understanding of Allied capabilities, but rather thousands of planes that darkened the sky. Allied air forces flew more than 14,000 sorties in support of the invasion operations on D-Day alone, having secured complete air superiority supremacy over the invasion area prior to the landings through months of systematic attacks on German airfields and aircraft production facilities. In stark contrast, the Luftwaffe had approximately 300 operational aircraft scattered across all of France, and on D-Day itself, German pilots managed to fly 319 sorties. The mathematical comparison was stark and unforgiving. For every single German aircraft that managed to get airborne, there were 46 Allied planes in the air. The numbers were not merely unfavourable from a German perspective, they were absurd. They represented a level of air superiority so complete that German ground forces would spend the entire Normandy campaign essentially without any air cover whatsoever. Major Josef Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, made what would become the most famous Luftwaffe attack on the invasion beaches that morning. With only his wingman, Heinz Wodarczyk, accompanying him, Priller strafed Sword Beach in a single pass before fleeing from the dozens of Allied fighters that immediately converged on his position. This incident, documented in multiple historical accounts and later featured in films about D-Day, demonstrated with brutal clarity the complete impotence of German air power in the face of Allied numerical superiority. Despite the overwhelming firepower arrayed against them, despite the naval bombardment and the complete absence of friendly air support, German defenders at certain positions initially believed they might succeed in repelling the invasion. At Omaha Beach in particular, elements of the 352nd Infantry Division occupied excellent defensive positions on the bluffs overlooking the beach approaches. Machine gun nests constructed from reinforced concrete created interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach route. The first waves of American infantry from the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions walked directly into a slaughter that threatened for a time to turn the entire invasion into a catastrophic failure. From the moment American soldiers hit the beach at 6:30 in the morning, machine gun fire erupted from the resistance nests positioned along the bluffs. Heinrich Severloh, the young farm boy from Metzingen, manned an MG-42 machine gun at Resistance Nest No. 62 and fired more than 12,000 rounds that morning, a fact documented from his own testimony given years after the war. Through his gun sight, he watched American soldiers fall by the dozens, then by the hundreds, as his gun and others like it stitched patterns of death across the beach. Bodies floated in the surf where they had fallen, the sand turned red with blood, and for a brief period that morning it genuinely appeared that the Atlantic Wall might hold against the invasion, that the German defenders might throw the Allies back into the sea just as Hitler had ordered. Then the destroyers came, and everything changed. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, with the situation on Omaha Beach reaching a critical point, and General Omar Bradley, commanding the American forces, actually considering the possibility of evacuating the beachhead, something unprecedented in naval warfare occurred. American destroyers, disregarding the substantial risks of running aground on the shallow beach or triggering mines in the uncleared waters, closed to within 1,000 yards of the beach, essentially point-blank range for naval guns. The USS McCook, USS Carmick, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt turned their 5-inch guns directly onto individual German strongpoints, engaging fortified positions at ranges where they could not possibly miss their targets. This action, thoroughly documented in American naval records, proved decisive in breaking the back of German resistance at Omaha Beach. For the German officers observing this unprecedented tactic, it marked the moment when they began to truly understand what American industrial might actually meant in practical terms. It was not merely about the number of ships, though that number was staggering. It was about the willingness to risk those ships, to use them as essentially expendable assets in pursuit of tactical objectives. The destroyer USS Corrie was indeed lost to German gunfire, but immediately other destroyers moved up to take its place without any hesitation. Ships were not precious, irreplaceable assets as they had become for the Kriegsmarine, which possessed only a shadow of its former strength. For the Americans, ships were tools, and America possessed thousands more tools in reserve. As the morning progressed and turned into afternoon, German observers witnessed something that completely defied their understanding of how amphibious operations were supposed to function. The landing craft simply kept coming, wave after wave, hour after hour, an endless conveyor belt of men and material flowing from the sea to the shore without any apparent diminishment. The variety of specialized vessels stunned German observers who had never imagined such purpose-built craft could exist. Landing Craft Tank, designated LCTS, disgorged 30-ton Sherman tanks directly onto the beaches, driving through the surf and up onto dry land. Landing ship tank vessels, known as LSTS, were massive ships 328 feet in length that deliberately beached themselves, opened their bow doors, and discharged entire tank companies complete with support vehicles. DUKWs, amphibious trucks that could swim like boats and drive like vehicles, transported supplies directly from ships offshore to combat units on the beach, eliminating countless logistical complications. By the time darkness fell on June 6th, the Allies had successfully landed approximately 156,000 troops onto the beaches of Normandy, with 132,715 arriving by sea and an additional 23,400 delivered by parachute and glider during the airborne operations. This force, landed in a single day, exceeded in size the entire German 7th Army responsible for defending the Normandy region. The documented Allied achievement in the first 24 hours of the invasion included 156,000 personnel, 20,000 vehicles of various types, 1,700 tanks, and 15,000 tons of supplies and ammunition. To provide context for these numbers, the German 7th Army defending the entire Normandy region possessed fewer than 500 operational tanks in total. The Allies landed more than 3 times that many tanks on the first day alone. The German response to the invasion revealed not merely material inferiority, though that was certainly present, but a systemic breakdown in command and control in the face of overwhelming enemy capability. The legendary panzer divisions, the armoured units that had conquered France in just 6 weeks during the 1940 campaign, found themselves effectively paralysed by the combination of Allied air supremacy and naval gunfire that could reach far inland. The 21st Panzer Division, the only German armoured unit positioned close enough to the invasion beaches to intervene on D-Day itself, began its counterattack at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The division required 3 full hours to move approximately 10 miles from its assembly area near Ranville to its attack positions, a journey that should have taken perhaps 30 minutes under normal circumstances. What German commanders had envisioned as a devastating armoured thrust that would drive the Allies back into the sea became instead a tragic procession of burning vehicles as Allied aircraft pounced on any German unit that attempted to move during daylight hours. When the surviving panzers of the 21st Division finally engaged British forces near Sword Beach, they encountered a new horror in the form of naval gunfire directed by forward observers who accompanied the invasion forces. HMS Warspite, a British battleship monitoring radio communications from her position 15 miles offshore, fired 15-inch shells that could penetrate the armour of any tank ever constructed. SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, commanding the 25th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment, would later write in his memoirs a reflection that captured the experience of German forces in Normandy. The enemy's material superiority was so great that our own strength was swept away like a wave breaking on a rock. On June 7th, designated D-Day +1 in military terminology, German reconnaissance aircraft that had managed to survive Allied air supremacy brought back photographs that senior German officers initially refused to believe could be authentic. The photographs appeared to show the Allies constructing harbours, not capturing existing ports as German planners had assumed would be necessary, but actually building artificial harbours from nothing in the open sea. The Mulberry harbours represented industrial capability on a scale that challenged human comprehension. These artificial ports had been prefabricated in Britain, disassembled, transported across the English Channel, and were being reassembled on the Normandy coast. The Mulberry harbours consisted of 600,000 tons of concrete formed into various components, 33 jetties for berthing ships, 10 miles of floating roadways to transport cargo ashore, and 93 ships that were deliberately sunk to serve as breakwaters protecting the artificial harbours from storm damage. Within just 2 weeks of D-Day, the Mulberry harbours were handling 9,000 tons of supplies daily, a volume that exceeded the capacity of many natural French ports. The Germans had spent 4 years constructing the Atlantic Wall specifically to protect the French ports from capture, believing that control of these ports would be essential for any Allied invasion to succeed. The Allies had simply eliminated the requirement for capturing ports by bringing their own ports with them, an engineering achievement that left German military planners struggling to comprehend what they were witnessing. Throughout June of 1944, as the battle for Normandy continued to rage, German commanders gradually came to realize the completeness of their intelligence failure regarding Allied invasion plans. The elaborate deception operation known as Operation Fortitude had successfully convinced German intelligence that the Normandy landings were merely a feint, a diversionary attack designed to draw German reserves away from the real invasion site. German commanders believed that the actual invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, and that it would be led by General George Patton's fictitious 1st United States Army Group. For crucial weeks following D-Day, substantial German reserves remained frozen in place around Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never materialize. General der Panzertruppe Leo Geyer von Schweppenburg, commanding Panzer Group West, discovered the truth of the deception when captured. American documents revealed Patton's actual location, not in England preparing to invade Calais, but in Normandy commanding the very real Third Army. The realization that they had been comprehensively deceived added psychological damage to the material destruction German forces were suffering. As June progressed into July, the reports that German officers submitted to higher headquarters became increasingly desperate in tone. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, serving as Commander-in-Chief West, received a telephone call from Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel at the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command, demanding to know why the invasion forces had not been thrown back into the sea as Hitler had ordered. When Keitel asked what should be done to salvage the situation, Rundstedt delivered his famous reply, "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" For this moment of honesty, Rundstedt was immediately relieved of his command and replaced with Field Marshal Günther von Kluge. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox who commanded Army Group B, met with Adolf Hitler on June 17th at Margaville in France. According to documented accounts from officers present at the meeting, Rommel presented detailed statistics showing the hopelessness of the German military position in Normandy. Complete Allied air supremacy that prevented any German movement during daylight hours, German divisions reduced to 30% of their authorized strength, and the impossibility of conducting any coherent defense when naval gunfire could reach targets far inland. Hitler's response to these facts was to forbid any retreat whatsoever, demanding that every German soldier fight with fanatical resistance to hold every metre of ground. Rommel left the meeting knowing with certainty that Germany was doomed to defeat. Within a month, he would be implicated in the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler and forced to commit suicide by taking poison. Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff who survived the war and later served in NATO, would write in his book Invasion 1944, Rommel and the Normandy Campaign, a reflection that encapsulated the German experience. We were not defeated by better soldiers or superior strategy. We were buried under an avalanche of material that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. The battle for the city of Caen demonstrated with brutal clarity the futility of German resistance against Allied material superiority. On July 7th, 467 Royal Air Force heavy bombers dropped 2,500 tons of bombs on Caen in the space of just 40 minutes, delivering more explosive power than the entire Luftwaffe possessed in all of France. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, one of Germany's elite armoured units, entered the Normandy battle with 20,540 men and 150 tanks. After 6 weeks of combat, the division had been reduced to 300 men and possessed no operational tanks whatsoever, having lost 8,000 soldiers killed during the battles around the Falaise Pocket alone. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Normandy beachhead beginning on July 25th, provided the final and most overwhelming demonstration of Allied material supremacy. In preparation for the ground assault, 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers dropped 3,300 tons of bombs in a concentrated carpet bombing attack, targeting an area measuring just 6,000 by 2,200 yards. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr Division positioned directly under this bombardment, transmitted a report that captured the experience in stark terms. My division has been annihilated. We are not fighting an army, we are fighting an industrial complex that can deliver more explosives in 1 hour than we can produce in a month. The Panzer-Lehr Division, which had entered Normandy with 190 tanks and 16,000 men, essentially vanished from existence. Of the 3,000 men positioned in the targeted area, 1,000 died instantly from the bombing, another 1,000 were wounded too severely to continue fighting, and the remaining 1,000 were too psychologically shattered by the experience to function as combat soldiers. The operation suffered tragic friendly fire incidents when some bombs fell short of their intended targets, killing 111 American soldiers and wounding 490 others, including Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, who became the highest-ranking U.S. officer killed in action in the European theatre. Yet even these significant casualties were absorbed without affecting the operation's ultimate success, a demonstration of the depth of Allied resources. The Falaise Pocket, which developed between August 12 and August 21 of 1944, became the graveyard where the German forces in Normandy were finally and completely destroyed. The documented statistics from this encirclement were nothing short of apocalyptic from a German perspective. Between 10,000 and 15,000 Germans were killed outright in the pocket, 40,000 to 50,000 were captured by Allied forces, 344 tanks and self-propelled guns were destroyed in the northern sector alone. 2,447 soft-skinned vehicles were abandoned when their fuel ran out, and 252 artillery pieces were lost. Between 20,000 and 50,000 Germans managed to escape the encirclement before it was completely sealed, but they emerged as disorganized remnants of broken units rather than cohesive fighting formations. The German General Staff, consisting of some of the most highly trained military minds in Europe, struggled to comprehend that they were not engaged in a conventional military campaign where strategy and tactics might turn the tide, but rather they were trapped in an industrial equation where the outcome had been mathematically determined before the first shot was fired. The production comparison between Germany and the United States for 1944 starkly illustrated the industrial dominance that underlay Allied military success. Germany in 1944 produced 39,807 aircraft, reached a peak monthly tank production of 1,854 units in December, and manufactured 68,000 military trucks for the entire year. American production in that same year included 96,000 aircraft, 29,000 tanks, and 650,000 military trucks, nearly 10 times the German production of vehicles alone. These statistics did not even include British, Canadian, or Soviet production, meaning that Germany was attempting to fight against the combined industrial output of virtually the entire world using the productive capacity of a medium-sized European nation that was being increasingly reduced by strategic bombing. Total American wartime production across all the years of conflict included 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 193,000 artillery pieces, 2 million army trucks, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. General Franz Halder, who had served as chief of the German General Staff earlier in the war, calculated after Germany's defeat that by 1944 the Allied advantage in war production was approximately 5-1 across most categories, and in certain specific categories such as trucks and transport vehicles, the advantage reached 10-1. As Halder would later write, "We were not defeated in the traditional sense. We were mathematically eliminated by an industrial capacity we could not match." The German officers who survived the Normandy campaign emerged psychologically transformed by their experiences. They had witnessed not merely military defeat, which was something professional soldiers could understand and accept, but rather the complete invalidation of Nazi ideology concerning German racial and cultural superiority and American weakness and decadence. Young officers who had grown up entirely under the Nazi regime and absorbed its propaganda from childhood were particularly affected by this cognitive dissonance. They had been repeatedly told that Americans were soft, spoiled by luxury and material abundance, incapable of the hard fighting that war demanded. Instead, they discovered that Americans had machines to do the hard work, radios to ensure perfect coordination, abundant ammunition to practice with until every soldier was proficient, and the confidence that came from knowing they had unlimited support behind them. The suicide rate among German officers who survived Normandy spiked dramatically in the months following the campaign. Defeat in battle was one thing that military training prepared men to handle, but the complete invalidation of their entire worldview was something altogether different and more psychologically destructive. Beyond the mere quantity of equipment and supplies, German officers in Normandy confronted a technology gap that revealed how far behind Germany had fallen in certain areas of military innovation. Proximity fuses, which the Americans employed in their anti-aircraft shells, turned what had been an inaccurate area weapon into a precision killing system that destroyed German aircraft with unprecedented efficiency. Radar-directed naval gunfire allowed Allied warships to hit targets many miles inland with first-round accuracy that seemed almost supernatural to German observers. DUKW amphibious trucks solved complex logistics problems that German military engineers had not even begun to conceptualize as solvable. The Allied use of specialized vehicles, particularly the array of modified tanks known as Hobart's Funnies, after their British designer, demonstrated an approach to warfare where engineering solved tactical problems that German doctrine expected to solve through the expenditure of soldiers' lives. Throughout the entire Normandy campaign, German officers developed a particular and profound dread of Allied naval gunfire that could reach far beyond the beaches. The battleship HMS Rodney mounted 9 16-inch guns that could fire shells weighing 2,048 pounds to distances of 23 miles inland, reaching deep into what German commanders had assumed would be safe rear areas. The USS Nevada, USS Texas, and HMS Warspite turned their massive main batteries into super-heavy artillery that could obliterate any target with a precision that left German forces with no safe positions anywhere within range of the coast. German artillery units that attempted to engage Allied positions found themselves under devastating counter-battery fire within minutes of revealing their positions, as Allied aircraft and ships worked together with a level of coordination that German forces simply could not match. The air superiority statistics told a story of complete and utter domination that rendered German forces essentially helpless during daylight hours. Allied forces maintained more than 12,000 aircraft in the theatre, while German forces had between 300 and 500 aircraft scattered across France, many of them obsolete or lacking fuel and ammunition. Allied aircraft flew between 5,000 and 8,000 sorties per day, while German forces managed perhaps 50 to 100 sorties when conditions permitted and fuel was available. The impact of this air superiority cannot be overstated. It meant that German forces could not move during daylight, could not concentrate for counterattacks, could not establish defensive positions without being observed and targeted, essentially could not conduct modern warfare as it was meant to be conducted. The final statistics from the Normandy campaign, covering the period from June 6th through August 30th of 1944, told the story of industrial warfare in numbers that remain staggering even decades later. Allied achievement during this period included landing 2,052,299 personnel, 438,471 vehicles of all types, and 3,098,259 tons of supplies and equipment, while flying more than 480,000 aircraft sorties in support of ground operations. German losses in Normandy included 240,000 killed in action, 200,000 captured, 2,200 tanks and assault guns destroyed, and more than 40 divisions effectively destroyed as coherent fighting formations. In 1954, exactly 10 years after the D-Day invasion, surviving German officers gathered in Bonn for a private symposium examining the Normandy campaign from a German perspective. General der Infanterie Günther Blumentritt, who had served as Chief of Staff to both Rundstedt and Klug, delivered the keynote address that reflected on the lessons learned from the catastrophic defeat. His words captured the fundamental transformation in warfare that Normandy represented. We learned in Normandy that war had changed fundamentally from what we had known. It was no longer primarily a contest between armies testing their skill and courage, but rather a contest between economic systems and industrial capacities. We counted our divisions and measured our soldiers' training and spirit, while they counted their factories and measured their production output. We measured courage and tactical proficiency, while they measured production capacity and logistical throughput. The image that haunts me still is not the sight of their soldiers, brave as they were, but the sight of American bulldozers casually pushing aside our destroyed tanks to clear roads for their supply trucks, treating our most powerful weapons as mere obstacles to be removed. The German officers who witnessed D-Day and survived the Normandy campaign were permanently and profoundly transformed by their experiences. Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, eventually became a general in NATO, helping to integrate West Germany into the Western Alliance and working alongside former enemies. Many Normandy veterans became strong advocates for European economic integration, having learned the hard lesson that only by pooling resources and industrial capacity could European nations hope to match the economic power that America had demonstrated. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in Italy and thus had experience fighting the Allies in both theatres, compared his experiences and noted a crucial distinction. In Italy, we could fight the Allies on relatively equal terms because the mountainous terrain prevented them from fully deploying their industrial might. In Normandy, on the open ground of northern France, where they could bring to bear their full industrial capacity and mobility, our forces were simply erased from existence. On June 6, 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Walter Olmsson returned to Crisbeck Battery as an honoured guest of the French government. The former Oberleutnant zur See, now 73 years old, stood once again at the same observation post where he had first sighted the invasion fleet 4 decades earlier. Speaking to gathered veterans from both sides of the conflict, he reflected on that morning with the perspective that only 4 decades could provide. My battery fought well that morning and throughout D-Day. We damaged 1 destroyer, hit a few other ships, disrupted some landing craft. But for every ship we hit, 100 others passed by unharmed and accomplished their missions. Young officers today study tactics and strategies from the Normandy campaign, seeking lessons they can apply. But I believe the real lesson is simpler and more fundamental than tactics. In modern war, the side that can produce the most material wins. Industrial capacity is military capacity. The sea of ships I saw that morning was not just an invasion fleet carrying soldiers to battle. It was American industrial might made visible and tangible, the physical manifestation of a productive capacity we could not hope to match. The German officers who watched nearly 7,000 Allied ships approach the Normandy coast on the morning of June 6, 1944, were witnessing more than a military invasion, more than an amphibious operation, more than the opening of a second front in Europe. They were witnessing the future of warfare itself, a future where industrial capacity would trump every other consideration, where production capability would matter more than tactical brilliance or individual courage. The image that haunted these officers for the remainder of their lives, that impossible armada stretching from horizon to horizon, represented the physical manifestation of democracy's latent power finally unleashed, of industrial might focused and applied to military purpose on a scale that rendered traditional military virtues largely irrelevant. The German defenders of Normandy had prepared themselves to fight a war, but instead they encountered something unprecedented, the full industrial capacity of the United States brought to bear on a single objective. The German officers who watched those ships approach knew in that moment of terrible clarity that they were witnessing not just the end of the Third Reich's control of Western Europe, but the end of warfare as they had understood it throughout their professional careers, and the birth of something entirely new. The sight of nearly 7,000 Allied ships crowding the waters of the English Channel on D-Day represented more than a tactical or strategic turning point in World War II. It marked the moment when industrial power fundamentally redefined modern warfare for generations to come. The Normandy landings unleashed an unstoppable flow of troops, tanks, aircraft and firepower that systematically crushed German defences and proved conclusively that production capacity, logistical capability and technological innovation would determine the outcome of future conflicts between industrialised nations. This enduring legacy of June 6, 1944, stands as a testament to Allied unity and cooperation, to American industrial might deployed on an unprecedented scale, and to the decisive impact of the Normandy invasion on both the defeat of Nazi Germany and the broader course of 20th century history, establishing patterns of industrial mobilization and military logistics that would influence military planning for decades to come.